guys, and we'll be recording. Thanks for taking time today. Our team has worked really hard on this for a long time, and we're always excited to share the results and the exciting piece of this. So welcome in housekeeping, be comfortable, eat, stretch, move as you like. Everyone's welcome here. We're scheduled for 90 minutes. If there's time left over, we'll end early as usual. It's okay to keep your screen off, screen on, very introvert friendly here, whichever works better for you. Pop on, pop off, little combination. We are going to ask everyone to make sure that your mics are on mute unless you're speaking. And definitely utilize that chat box as questions pop up, comments, emojis, all of that. With that, as your questions do come up, go ahead and pop them in the chat and we'll get to them. And we'll also have Q&A peppered throughout the presentation today. And of course, this workshop is being recorded for future public use, so everyone is aware. And yeah, during the Q&A, please participate. We want to hear your thoughts, your feedback, all of that as we get along through our agenda. So today it's going to be broken down into three big chunks. Our census results, yay, lots of great info and data. Part two, the vendor data from our 2019 through 2021 beginning vendor support project. And this was a really big comprehensive project. We're going to try to put into like 12 slides for you guys, but there's a ton of information and we're excited to share it with you. And then we're going to just, take a few minutes, talk about why this data collection is so valuable for all of us and why these methods were effective. And on that note, a little bit about our methodology that our team used with this. And this is a really comprehensive look at farmers markets. This year, timing was key. We were really lucky in 2019. We decided to do our first ever comprehensive census of farmers markets in Oregon. So this is all really exciting that we're like culminating this over the past 3 years. We didn't know at the time, of course, the pandemic was looming, it struck, and we're starting to, fingers crossed, knock on everything, come out of the pandemic. So this census reflects all the havoc that was wreaked over the past few years, including natural disasters. And we are just really excited to be tracking this recovery for the markets and to what extent that recovery has been and share that with you guys. The methodology to collect the data involved waiting until mid-November when most markets had finished their seasons, reaching out to market managers, equivalent knowledgeable persons who were targeted to take the census on behalf of their market. We used announcements in our newsletter, listservs, and on Facebook, and hopefully we captured everyone that wanted to partake and share their data. In January, we split the work amongst our amazing team here to compile and calculate the responses into totals. That's a really fun part to watch too. Everyone looks at the data differently and in great detail, and it's a really nice way to customize everything. We researched markets that didn't respond and estimated the answers as best we could. Then we began putting the pieces together to analyze what this all means. What's the story here? And those discussions and stories turned into this presentation. So for the past 3 years, we've held steady between 70 to 80 markets responding. That's a really great response rate. And in 2021, this year, we had responses from 75 markets. So about 72% of market locations throughout Oregon. So really, really good sampling. We did have great response rates overall. We're missing our micro markets in Oregon. And we, since we didn't get those responses, we used estimations. And we'd love to engage micro markets more. So if anybody, is connected, pass them our way, spread the word. We want their voices involved. The vendor level data that we'll be presenting was collected as part of OFMA's Beginning Vendor Support Network, represents over 200 farms and businesses who participate in the Albany, Baker City, Clascony, Manzanita, and Umpqua Valley farmers markets. And a big thank you to everyone that participated. All the markets that participated in taking time to turn in the census responses, thank you so much. Without your support, we would not be able to show such a solid understanding of how markets and vendors experienced the last 3 years. And this data and presentation represents all of your hard work to keep things going, all the pivots that you had to do, and all the problem solving that's gone into the past 3 years. We're really appreciative. And we hope this presentation gives back your data and is rewarding and enlightening. And thank you all so much. And I think we're going to have Ari kick us off here.
Yeah, let's get to the numbers. Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so I think the first kind of question is just to define what we're looking at, which is all the farmers markets in Oregon. So from the responses we got in the census, as well as some additional markets we knew about or were able to research or add to these totals, we counted that there were in 2021 113 market organizations. And then obviously some of those organizations are operating more than one market. So the total number of farmers markets operating in Oregon in 2021 is 136. We've asked this question for the last 3 years, so we can see some of the trend there, and as far as we know, this is the most markets than ever recorded, probably the most markets operating in Oregon than ever before. We don't really know about those past years, but there does seem to be a overall uptrend. Last year, since we're only counting markets that were operating in 2020 census, I should say, the numbers dipped a little bit. Some markets chose not to operate that year or were not able to. But in 2021, they came back and we saw both a higher number of organizations and individual markets operating than before COVID. Next slide. Those markets were distributed all over the state. And also, so there's up here, markets were open a total of 2,518 days in 2021. So that's a lot of days. The biggest chunk of markets geographically were located in the Portland area as well as in the Willamette Valley, but we had, number of markets that we were able to identify or who responded to the survey operating in the coast or in Southern Oregon, Central, Eastern, and the Mount Hood, Columbia River Gorge area. We've got our little donut chart to show that breakdown. Visitation, so this is crowd counts. So these numbers essentially are the total crowd counts recorded by markets in the state for these years. So total number of visits, not individual shoppers, but visits across the state. So we'll see a lot of graphs and charts in this presentation that look like this. They go down for 2020 and then come back to some degree or another in 2021. So as you can see, market visits dropped significantly in the previous year's census and the 2020 census due to COVID, and a lot of markets even restricting, restricting number of crush hoppers and all things like that, and then bounce back significantly, not entirely back up to 2019 levels, but significantly to 3.4 million visits in 2021. So I'll just say that's still a very big number. 3 million visits is a lot of people coming out to farmers markets to shop. This just shows the breakdown by size. We identified, Ashley mentioned, I'll start at the bottom, mentioned micro markets. There are a type of market that we don't have a lot of visibility into, but those are markets as we define fewer than 10 vendors at peak season. Small markets 10 to 24 vendors, medium 25 to 49. Large markets are 50 to 100, and then extra large over 100. So we identified markets of all different sizes. The average market is still like a small to medium sized market in the state. So while there are several very large markets, those are still kind of a minority of the overall universe of farmers markets. All right, the big one, total sales. So this, I was really pleased and surprised to see, really did in the aggregate, in the total of all markets across the state, really bounced back pretty significantly in 2021, really to the point of being just about the same as the pre-pandemic levels of sales. So, we saw 63 million total sales across the state in 2019, decreased significantly, essentially fell by half in 2020 and then recovered back to 61 million, essentially the same as it was pre-pandemic in 2021. Again, this is in the aggregate. So as we'll see in the next slide, it wasn't necessarily the uniform across the state. And we saw, definitely different trends. So looking at this slide, as you can see, like Greater Portland and Willamette Valley farmers markets in the aggregate were actually up, from pre-pandemic levels, whereas markets, particularly the Oregon coast, where sales fell even from the 2020 levels and, are still well below 2019. Also Southern Oregon. This on the right side shows the trend from 2019 to 2021. And then Eastern Oregon also sales a little lower than the pre-pandemic levels. And this slide just shows total vendors. So again, a very similar trend. 6,700. So this number is basically the total of all of your vendor counts. So it's not exactly the number of vendors because there are some vendors that are shared between farmers markets, but it gives us kind of a number that we can compare year to year. So again, the number of vendors fell, not by as much as sales or crowds, but fell pretty significantly by 30% in 2020, and then came back up, but not quite to the pre-pandemic levels, to 5,900 total businesses, total stalls, essentially, at farmers markets across the state in 2021. I think Amanda is going to talk next about SNAP sales at farmers markets.
Hi, yeah, I'm going to go into some of SNAP sales and some of other finances stuff, budgets and staffing. So this year, again, the majority of farmers markets are offering at least one of the food assistance programs, whether that's SNAP and Double Up Food Bucks or the Farm Direct program. And then for the totals of that, combining OFMA census data with data that was collected by Farmers Market Fund, we estimated that SNAP sales in Oregon were about 1.6 million in 2021. We didn't make an estimation in 2019, but compared to 2020, there's been a huge increase due to a little bit of more markets offering SNAP and Double Up Food Bucks. We're really excited to see more markets have come on with those programs. But a lot of the increase is just in general of people needing to use SNAP due to the pandemic and other current economic realities. Overall in 2021, over $1 billion in SNAP was distributed to Oregonians, and less than 1% of those SNAP benefits are used at farmers markets. So switching into a section now on market finances, this year we asked about market budgets because we wanted to find out how much it takes to pull off all of the amazing work that you do serving your vendors and communities. We got 68 market organizations responded with a figure for their yearly budget, and we found that the median budget was only about $25,000 or less, and that most markets are working with a budget of $50,000 or less. Yeah, next slide, thanks. And looking at where the money comes from to fund a market's budget, we found that from your 68 answers, the median farmers market collects between 1/2 and 3/4 of its revenue from stall fees. But there's pretty wide variation on this, especially when looking at market size. For instance, it really varies with the medium and small markets, how much they depend on fees. And 1/4 of extra large markets rely solely on vendor fees to fund their operating budget. And the large markets, 40% earn between 1/2 and 3/4 of their budget through vendor fees. Okay, and then so what are those stall fees? So asking about stall fees, this can be kind of complicated to compare with the different tiers and criteria that markets use, charging different rates to different types of vendors or offering discounts for things like multiple stalls or blocks of days or the whole season in a lump sum. That happens a lot. And also, while most markets in Oregon use flat rates, a few base their fees on a % of the vendor's sales. But we wanted you to be able to see where your market's fees fall in comparison to other markets. And so we asked about what you all charge for a 10 by 10 stall for farms, and that seemed like a good baseline to go off of. So when markets do a flat rate, most charged less than $36 per stall. Of the 15 markets charging $36 or more, 13 were in the greater Portland region and 2 were in the Willamette Valley region. And stall fees are lower at smaller markets. Over half of small markets charge $25 or less, and they're higher at larger markets. However, fees do vary within the size groups we saw. 4 markets in our response group use a percentage type fee with their vendors, and 2 small markets in the state actually don't charge any stall fees currently. Okay, looking at staffing, the 64 responding markets with employees or contractors have 2.6 paid positions on average, and we're offering a total of 166 paid positions last year, which is basically the same as what we found in 2019 census. And coming out of all of the upheaval of 2020, this perhaps says that our market world hasn't reduced staffing long-term, but we do know that from 2020 there was a lot of turnover. A third of markets changed staff that year, and that also continued into 2021. There was a good amount of turnover as well. So a lot of you out there are new, as we saw who attended our boot camp for new managers this past February, and just welcome. We're glad you're here. Thanks for coming. Let's see, so hours worked. Respondents worked an average of 800 hours at their farmers market for the year. For the most part, we know it was market managers who were answering the census. And so these rates and hours reflect what a market manager works. That's about 15 hours per week, but we know most markets concentrate work hours during the summer season. And extra large markets averaged 1,900 hours, while managers averaged around 400 hours at small markets. Overall, 85% of the responding markets pay their staff. And then there are a few markets, about 15%, with only volunteers as workers. And the fully volunteer-run markets are most likely to be a small market. So statewide, the median pay rate has increased from 2019's $17.50 per hour to $19 or almost $20 per hour, depending on how we counted those responses. That said, looking at the ranges, it's tough to see that there are market staff out there that are making way less than minimum wage in some cases. This table is showing the median wages broken out geographically based on Oregon's Bureau of Labor and Industries definitions. And we've compared them to the minimum wages as of last year when these salary figures were collected. The living wage rates that we're listing here are the same ones that we used back in 2019, which were reported by the Oregon Center for Public Policy, where hourly wages were calculated for what it costs to afford a 1-bedroom apartment across Oregon. We couldn't find an update across these definitions from that group, but this link that we're going to put here in the chat, it goes to a calculator you can use that measures the income a family needs to have to attain an adequate standard of living in different locations across Oregon. These pay levels indicate that a lot of markets are depending on their staff having a certain level of privilege and outside support so they can accept a job that doesn't pay a lot. And that's a real concern for OFMA since it represents, this is where that instability and a constant cycles of hiring at markets comes from. And it's a huge barrier to having Black and brown people in leadership at farmers markets as well. So now we're going to take a little break for questions about all the figures and facts we've just shown you. welcome to put those in the chat or just come off.
Amanda, there were a couple of questions about the breakdown of hours in FTE, if we had any information about that, but I'm
Okay, let me open up my chat so I can see this.
So I put the question in there as it was phrased, and it was just paid staff positions employed or contracted for in 2021. FTEs are nice because they do a more apples to apples comparison, but to get to that, we would need to collect a lot more data from the person who is filling out the survey for each individual staff position. It would need to be, position, total hours. That is perhaps something that is worthwhile. So this is where we need your guys' feedback.
Yeah, it was hard. The census is pretty long at like almost 30 or 40 questions. And we definitely spent some time on like, how do we ask about hours? And people have so many different setups at their market of like, people are paid seasonally or with a stipend, or they're paid hourly, or they get a salary, or they're a contractor, or they're employee, and trying to find a way to ask only a couple questions about this, but still get you some information. We're just not able to break it down from what we currently ask. But if there's a lot of interest in that, we could definitely expand that part of the census to get more information. We know that this is really popular information that people want to hear.
And Stephanie, to your comment, we are working on an easily accessible document that's going to show the data split across to get you beyond the aggregate. Our goal today is to show you aggregate data to encourage awareness and buy-in to the census, to get your feedback on what parts work and don't work. But we do want to make this data more accessible to you. So look forward to some tables that break out these aggregates by region and by market size to get to your point, to help you sort of situate your market and understand your market within the state.
Rebecca, I love your comment. Ditto. Does anybody else have any specific questions about where we're at so far? No, we're good. We can move on to part 2. Great. So the second part of this presentation, previously we talked a lot about what happened this year at the market level, and now we want to give the vendor level story. While we don't have all the states data, we do have a really good data set for 5 markets. And we want to present that case study to you now. Dr. Mallory Rahe is the big title, Agricultural Business and Policy Education Director for University of Missouri Extension. Dr. Rahe has been working with us really closely as our lead researcher on our past beginning vendor support network, which wrapped up last year. And we're very excited that she'll be joining us for our Farmers Market Learning Network moving forward with our new USDA grant. And she's going to present now about all the vendors to you guys. And like before, at the end, if you have questions, it would be a great time to have a group discussion. So Mallory, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. And those of you who've been on this presentation before know that I used to live in Oregon, and I used to work at Oregon State University before taking a job at the University of Missouri that put me closer to my family, which was really a relief since we did that in the middle of 2019 and then the pandemic started. So to your original point, Melissa, I wish I could run over to the coast this afternoon, because I would. And I used to be able to do that if I was still in Corvallis. But I just want to start with a big thank you to our 5 markets who worked really, really hard for 3 years to collect a lot of information from our vendors. And this data, just to kind of reinforce a point, we are very privileged to have this data. It was very difficult to collect this data. It took a lot of effort, but there is not a lot of this data that is being collected or analyzed or talked about nationally. We have a set of 5 markets. They're mostly small and medium sized. They're mostly in rural areas. This was a pilot, right? We were really trying to understand this cohort learning network and data collection, and how do we bring more of a data collection mindset to Oregon. And we've learned a lot, and we still have more questions. So I'm going to give you a very fast preview, and just to remind you all that we are going to continue this work with a broader expanded cohort of 10 markets for the next 3 years. And I'm excited to sort of continue to make this data really useful to you as market managers. So just like the overall average for OFMA, our BVSN markets, that's my, the name of the project, BVSN, Beginning Vendor Support Network. We also saw this, decline and then a rebound in 2021 that often didn't quite get us back to where we were in 2019. However, when you look at our overall sales, we did actually grow our overall sales at these markets 17% from 2019 to 2021. That was following a 9% decline. Average customer spending was what drove that, because our total vendor count was still lower in 2021 than it was in 2019. And as we examine the vendor sales for 416 different vendors who came in and out of these 5 markets, here are some of the high level observations, the characteristics that tend to lead to higher sales on average. And I want to make a point that our definition of value added vendors may be different than yours, because we're including all of those vendors that make a processed product, whether or not they're growing the inputs. If you're making blueberry jam with local blueberries, you may or may not be growing those blueberries to be considered a value added vendor in our data set. So let's get into some of these trends. So this, we're going to talk more about the importance of data collection and the importance of kind of thinking strategically about your market and what your market is capable and the amount of food that you're moving through your market. I want to remind you of our sample. This is mostly small and medium-sized markets. This is looking at 3 years of average daily sales by different types of vendors. And I want you to see 2 things. The first is that farm and value-added vendors tend to have higher average daily sales than craft and art vendors. And the second thing is that we saw average daily sales growth within each vendor type across each year. So the lighter color bar is 2019, and that darkest color bar with the dollar number is the 2021 data. Next. Part of our project was to understand the learning curve of being a vendor at a farmer's market. And I think this is maybe the best graph that really reinforces that, although we're going to look at this pattern in a series of graphs to come. So this shows year over year sales for returning vendors. So we're controlling for the fact that often low sales vendors do not return. They'll come in and then they'll leave. These are returning vendors. So 2021, their years of experience, and those that were and then their 2020 sales. So this first column, those are those brand new 2021 vendors that we never saw at our markets in a previous year. The second years of farmers market experience, those are vendors who we saw for the first time in 2020. When they came back in 2021, you can see they had a bump in their average daily sales. And as their years of farmers market experience increased, so did their average daily sales as a group. There's an exception with this group of vendors with 5 to 9 years of farmers market experience. It's an outlier in the pattern. And I'll just say that we do have a small data set. So this is one of those things that we're going to keep looking at as we expand our data and look at additional years of data. Next. One of our other findings that has been, again, consistent across 3 years of data is that how often a vendor attends the market is also correlated with higher average daily sales. So vendors with the lowest attendance rate are, again, a bit of an anomaly. And we see that some of this is explained by the fact that we have short season but high value crop vendors. Think Oregon strawberries, classic example. And in the next slide, we'll look at the fact that these are also larger businesses that attend the market less frequently, but have very high average daily sales when they do attend. But setting those aside, the more consistent you are attending a market, the higher average daily sales you tend to have on average. Next. So one thing to stress is that farmers markets play a different role for every vendor at the market. That there's so much diversity in both the type of markets and the type of vendor and their goals for being at that farmers market. So 27% of all of the vendors that we looked at relied on the farmers market for 75% or more of their total business sales in 2020. We asked the survey in 2021 about the previous year. So that group tends to have lower average daily sales, the red bar. They also tend to have lower average season sales. That's the darker red dot, all the way to the right-hand side of that graphic. But as a business grows and it starts to use additional market channels, including additional farmers markets beyond the primary market that we were observing them in, so their overall reliance on the primary farmers market declines, but we see that their average daily sales and their average season sales tends to increase. And here's what I was speaking about at the previous slide. Those vendors that have very low reliance on the farmers market, less than 25% of their sales, they have very high daily sales, but they have lower season sales. They don't attend as often either, but when they come, they're a large established business, they do well, and even if they're not there as often, they're making a very strong contribution to sales at that market. And when we look at this across vendor type, value-added vendors are most likely to participate in multiple sales channels, while our craft and art vendors are the least likely. Next. So as I said, our total vendors are also declined, and we saw this at the state level too. And the advantage of this data is we can look into that a little bit more closely. So we still had 15% fewer vendors in this 5 market set. And when you look at rebound, not surprisingly, farm vendors dropped the least, and they came back very strong. Craft and art vendors dropped a lot, but also strong rebound. This is a very entrepreneurial group, a lot of new entrants to the farmers market in 2021. But look at our value-added vendor category. They dropped in 2020, and they largely did not come back. We saw no rebound in this category among these markets. This could be caused by more COVID restrictions facing these vendors around, prepared foods and what you can actually eat at the market. And they also have more market opportunities, as I just spoke about. So one question that I would ask you to, contribute in the chat if you would like is this question of, has your market struggled to recruit value-added vendors back or not? Next. And then this is the last data slide. So like I said, we observed a lot of total vendors at our market. And if we look at only our farm vendors, we can see, and we further look at only those farm vendors who came to our 5 markets for more than 1 year. I'm trying to look at the role of experience, vendor experience, and customer recognition. So year over year, we see an increase, whether you started in 20 and came back in 2021, this is all the way to the left, you see a growth in sales. Whether you came in 19 and you came back in 20, you see a growth in sales. Those vendors that were with us all 3 years show a very strong, consistent growth in sales. But look at the vendors that were at the market in 2019. They skipped in 2020 and they came back in 2021. There's no growth in sales, despite the fact that these vendors had similar sales in the prior year as those vendors who did return and saw a substantial increase. So to me, this says that it matters. Customer recognition matters. There's also some learning curve to pricing, advertising, displaying of things that perhaps vendors have to relearn when they sit out for a season. So finally, I wanted to wrap up with sort of my thoughts on how you might use this information as a farmers market manager. And I want to encourage everyone to really think about your market as a business incubator. That was the focus of our project. We wanted to understand how new and beginning vendors use farmers markets. We worked hard to develop tools to support vendors, new and beginning vendors. And then all this effort to measure sales and learn about vendor characteristics is to help us, again, tease out any trends we can find about retention and business changes. What does a farmer's market contribute to a vendor business? And how do we tell that story to the benefit of farmers markets in the state of Oregon? We're going to keep going with this, and I'm really excited. But I think what we've seen is that the early years of a vendor experience are really important. It's a great opportunity to learn. And as a farmers market manager, if you have the capacity to, you can really play a role in helping that learning. So here's some suggestions. Try to form a relationship with those new vendors, those first-time vendors who are showing up at your market. Encourage them to attend regularly. If they're going to make a commitment to a farmer's market, our data suggests that they need to make a consistent commitment. They will get the most out of their experience if they really stick it out and work hard to refine their ability to be at a market and their ability to form a customer base. Consider peer mentorship opportunities. In our survey of data, that's how our vendors said that they learned the most. So can your market pair established vendors with new and beginning vendors, or do some other activities that promote co-learning? And then consider providing information on how to be a vendor. And OFMA is doing a great job with toolkits and will continue to develop these tools. So ultimately, the vendors are the ones who are responsible for the success of your business, of their business. Like, that's not on market managers. But I do think that market managers are uniquely situated to help them understand the uniqueness of a farmer's market and how to make the most of that channel. Okay. And please reach out if you have any questions. Amanda Cross and I meet regularly. I'm happy to do more follow-up offline.
Great. And Katie, you had a question about how many vendors, and everyone saw Amanda answered that there were 319 vendors, which is a huge sample. That's amazing. And no questions for Mallory. I'm taking it, and we can move on to questions for you guys. So for everyone that's here, if you're already collecting your vendor sales, pop your name, your market name in the chat. It's just a great way for us to get a visual on folks who are here today. Give everybody a minute to do that. Hollywood getting two. Way to go, guys. Great. Well, thank you guys for plugging that in, and keep plugging your names in there. It looks like a lot of you, the bulk of you, which is wonderful. And it takes us to our next topic about why data collection, the process of data collection, and then having the data is important. And we can break it down into 3 ways. It helps OFMA, it helps you, and it's just a really great picture of progress. So obviously it helps track the condition and growth of farmers markets throughout Oregon helps us understand trends, challenges, and opportunities. And to me, the most valuable thing is it tells a story. It tells about our impact. It tells about our importance, and it tells about the value that farmers markets bring to Oregon. It helps us factually understand and predict trends. It can tell us what the future holds. I mean, how unpredictable were the past 3 years, and we are still able to pull out trends that hold true. And I think that's magical. And having this particular data and Mallory's support with our team, who would have known that you could get such trends through such unpredictable times? It also helps define what's working. So that means that you can change or eliminate things that aren't working, that you may think these are really valuable things to do for our market. You can look at this data and say, oh, wow, maybe this is time we don't need to spend, or we need to redirect some resources and time to what is, proving to work through this data. It helps you make those decisions, form new strategies, where you want to go with your market. You can use this data to compare and say, okay, we have this proof that if we have our vendors show up regularly, if we encourage them to show up regularly, they're going to be more successful. Our market will be more successful. What can we do to support them to be here more often and more frequently? You can understand the scale of the impact you're having on the community. This is one of my favorite talking points about farmers markets in Oregon. We generally have tiny budgets for our markets. We have a huge economic impact, especially on the ag industry here in Oregon. And that is a really compelling story to tell funders, to tell farmers, to tell your local representatives, to tell your volunteers, to tell your shoppers. It's just a really good story. And this data helps illustrate that, back it up. If you're doing grant applications, if you're recruiting new vendors, if you're spreading the word in marketing, this data is there for you to use for that. And I think that that's extremely valuable for all of us. Not only do these numbers tell a great story, but you'll inevitably get stories as part of your data collection, right? You're interacting more with your vendors, you're interacting more with your shoppers, you're getting those stories directly as well as collecting the data. And that helps you build relationships. It helps you build systems. When you're going to collect data, you're going to maybe recognize that you need to have a system in place to record something. And it can really help build and strategize your systems and your processes. And I find that very valuable. And it can open up conversations with your vendors, your shoppers, your community, your stakeholders about what they find to be valuable. And it's just really wonderful and awesome to have. And I love it. I'm a data nerd. And like Rebecca said, there's all the data that you want and then the data that you can collect. And so we're trying to make that balance. And it's an important learning tool. And I'm glad that we have it, and our team worked really, really hard to put all this together and have it. And we're going to continue to track these things, and we'll have some really amazing trends to show and more stories to tell. And I think Amanda's going to give us a few more examples of how we understand and advocate for farmers markets in the community.
Yeah, just like on the state level, on the OFMA level, and how we report back to you guys. I mean, collecting data through the census was how we were able to talk to you about how much farmers market staff are typically paid. I would say that's one of the biggest questions that I get. With 2019 census, we aggregated your responses into this easily shareable info sheet, which many of you requested and took to your market leadership. And I don't know if I get to say it caused the increase we saw in 2021's median pay rate, but I know some individual stories from market staff that having that info available was helpful in the pay scale conversations they were having at their markets. Let's see, Ashley, I think you were going to cover some more about what OFMA does.
Yeah, just revisiting that. This data that you guys have given us from your markets can really help us combine it, tell a story, and promote the ROI that farmers markets have throughout the entire state and within your communities. Again, just talking about how we have these lean, efficient budgets, yet a huge economic impact. I think that that's just cannot be understated. And then it also gives us really great demographic data of who we're reaching, the vendors that are present, the community that this is supporting, and who's shopping. And we are going to hopefully return this question in future censuses as well. And we collected it in 2019. And it's just really great market level data that we can combine to tell a larger story, and you guys can also use within your local communities.
Yeah, and now we'll actually hear from a couple markets about how they use the data at their market and with their vendors. So first we'll hear from Ari at Hollywood, and then Amanda from Umpqua Valley Farmers Market and Canyonville too.
Yeah, so I can talk just a little bit about our experience at Hollywood Farmers Market in Portland, specifically around collecting daily vendor gross sales, which is something that prior to 2021, we didn't really do in any kind of a systematic way. Every now and then we would do kind of spot collections, but nothing that fed into like a larger kind of framework where we could use it for decision making, and found that it really was actually a very powerful tool in not just, as some people have said, like seeing our impact in, in our economic impact and impact in the community, which I think was actually really instructive, but also just in the way of using that to see how management decisions of the market affected vendor sales and use that information to feed back into management decisions. So like an example is that this past winter, our winter season that just ended, we substantially expanded the market, added, I think on average, it ended up being about like 12 new vendor stalls throughout the winter season. And so a big question in making that decision was going to be, what's the impact of that on sales? Is that going to pull sales away from other existing winter market vendors, or will it just kind of free up, more? It will just attract more spending, essentially. And then we were able to see through kind of rigorously collecting vendor level daily sales data, we were able to see that average vendor sales were consistent from last winter to this winter. This was the first year that we actually have a baseline now to compare to. And so that was really helpful, because if we had seen, for instance, the opposite, that, vendor sales, average sales were actually down by 20%, then we go, okay, well, maybe we should rethink that expansion, So it was a tool that we wouldn't have previously had to be able to evaluate how well that decision went, other than just kind of qualitatively talking to vendors. And ended up, I think, being really useful. So that was our experience.
Amanda, do you want to share from Umpqua Valley, Canyonville?
Sure. So we started collecting data in 2019. Anyone who's like beginning to collect data it's quite the adventure. You will absolutely get pushback from your vendors. And really for me, it was just, I've spent 5 years developing relationships with these people who are running these really amazing businesses. And really it's just a level of trust and sharing with them that only aggregate information will be shared. We added it to our handbook too, that sales declarations were mandatory. That helped. We did have to get rid of a vendor who just was not willing to cooperate. Usually those vendors have other issues going on as well. So sometimes you have to kind of follow through with the rules. But one thing that was really kind of easy for me to overcome was there's a fear of reporting to the IRS, which is crazy, and really my response to them is usually, I'm pretty sure I don't have your social security information. I'm not a tax accountant. Like, that's nothing that I want anything to do with. Let's just have fun. And that just kind of softens the blow a little bit for that. Another thing with collecting data for us that was really relevant to our situation was we had an indoor market for the winter time. And as soon as the pandemic hit, we immediately went outside back to our regular summer location, and the numbers just flew off the charts. So that data I was then able to use for the next year, as there's no way we are packing up and going back indoors Everyone had more space. We were way more visible. Our crowd counts increased. Everyone's dollars per market increased. The average numbers that the customers spent increased as well. So buy yourself a propane heater and get outside. We're staying outside was basically how I used that information to share with our vendors. I also use it when gathering information for grants and for funding opportunities. At our annual meetings every year, we call it the state of the market, which we put together all of our data that we've collected with all of our programs, how our numbers have increased. And it's just such a great story to tell. I also use this when I'm recruiting or when I'm talking to new potential vendors. It kind of gives them, I think, more of a real aspect of what to expect when they join the market. And it also gives them, I like to think of it as a way for them to get creative if they aren't kind of matching up with some of those numbers. Maybe we change. I can help them change their setup, or it also gives me a unique perspective when analyzing sales as to maybe there is a gap in the product. So like any new farmers that come on, I'm always like, please grow strawberries. There are never enough strawberries. That is the first thing that sells out in the market. So you can use the data in all different ways, but really it's we have such a unique perspective as a market manager, because not only do we get the data, but we also have all the interactions with the community members. We hear what they want, and we get to see what sells out. So we can use those things to, recruit potential vendors who can help make the market the best it can be. The data has just, for me, it's also a measure of how well I am doing. Even though, I'm not selling that person's product for them, but I am doing the marketing. I am out in the community, spreading information, and I am the face of the market that, there's a social buy-in that you get via this information. So I encourage everyone to definitely collect the data and utilize it, because it's a tool that doesn't lie. So.
Thank you, Ari and Amanda. That was wonderful. So getting into how to decide what to collect, because we want to encourage more data collection from all of you. We checking in on our neighbors in Washington State, their association looked at this really closely in 2010 and came up with some key data points that they thought markets should collect. And they based their choices on what data to collect, in that it needs to be realistic for one manager with one market to have the capacity to collect. It needs to be meaningful, and you need to be able to aggregate that data with other markets' data at a larger scale, whether city, county, or the state. And if you want to see their whole list of what they talk about collecting, we'll put that link in the chat here. But basically what OFMA is suggesting that markets in Oregon collect are vendor sales and crowd counts. We know most markets in Oregon don't have a lot of data to work with right now. Currently, only about a quarter of the markets who responded to the census are directly collecting vendor sales on a regular basis. And when we ask you to fill out the census, we do allow best guesses. But what would having more accurate vendor sales and crowd count data look like? When Ari, who's been reviewing your census answers on the vendor numbers, sales, and customers for the last 3 years, he thinks that markets that are just completely guessing are most likely underestimating their impact, and thus the role that you play for your vendors and all the people that you serve. So he's going to explain what he's seen and show you how to produce some, show you how to produce some better guesses.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So yeah, like Amanda said, it's only about 25% of markets that are as of now directly collecting that gross vendor sales data. And so like we've said, I think we do think there are a lot of benefits to doing that, but we recognize that a lot of markets, probably aren't going to do that in the future, just due to capacity and other impediments. But we do think we can help with markets that are guessing, just have a better sense. We did see a lot, in the census data. A lot of folks who are guessing, what does seem to be underestimates. And, I recognize that it's just a census the folks are filling out, in a few minutes there at the end of their day. But I do think that there's sort of a systematic undervaluing of what we think our impact might be, sort of our gut estimates. Like for instance, like a market this is just an anonymous example from the census, a market with average of 80 vendors per market that operated 40 weeks a year. So a pretty large market. Their annual crowd counts that they were recording were 100,000. And their estimate for their gross sales was 200,000 for the year. So that is most likely, an underestimate. It assumes that the average shopper is spending $2, or like the average vendor is only making like about $50 or $60. That's probably an underestimate. And there were a lot of, responses to census that were like that. So on the next couple slides, I'm hoping to just give you guys some kind of tools for just making these back of the envelope guesses, estimates of your sales to maybe have a better sense, because, that market is maybe that, is walking around thinking that their total economic impact on their community is only $200,000. And if it really is, say, like 800,000 or $1 million, that, they should know that. They should feel that and kind of approach their organization with that knowledge in terms of how they think about their impact. So you can go to the next slide. I'll talk a bit more about what I'm thinking. So how do we make better guesses? And so ideally, we would make these guesses based on something that you are already collecting, but that can be extrapolated into an estimate for your gross sales. So one thing is crowd counts. A lot more markets are collecting crowd count data than are collecting gross sales. I actually don't have the number, but I think it's like 60% or something like that. They're collecting crowd count more. Theoretically, if you average total crowd count, what the average spending of each of those people coming to the market is, you can just multiply those two numbers together, and that gets you an estimate for your total gross sales that, is probably reasonably accurate, or at least, closer maybe than just a total guesstimate. But the question is, how do you estimate that average spending per shopper? If, you might have customer surveys or dot surveys or something that might point you in, the space of a right answer. Well, yeah, and Rebecca's saying if your dot surveys are asking people as their households, then yes, you would want to divide that by 2 or by some estimate of the households. It all depends on what you're saying for average spending per shopper. But using it as just per adult shopper, we looked at the markets that do collect rigorous sales data in the census and looked at what their answers, what their data suggests is the average spending per adult shopper. And that they had a range, pretty much all of them were in a range between about $12 and $25. So that's a range, but if you pick something in that range as your estimate, you're probably pretty likely to be, reasonably close. You probably won't be off by, say, like 5 times or 10 times, in your estimate of your gross sales. And that's a pretty, broad range of markets within that 20 markets. That's not, for instance, just like large markets or just Portland markets. It's a pretty diverse group of 20 markets throughout the state. So I think that range is pretty realistic for what most markets in Oregon would be experiencing. So that's one method, if you have crowd count data. Maybe you don't have crowd count data, or maybe you don't think the crowd count data that you have is very reliable for whatever reason. So there's another way you could do it. You could do it based on your vendor counts, which you probably do know. You probably know how many vendors you have, on average, say, each week. Then theoretically, you could take your average weekly vendors and the number of weeks that you were open. So those are both things that you pretty much know. Multiply that by what the average vendor sales you think are, and then that'll give you also an estimate for gross sales that'll probably be, again, kind of in the right ballpark, the right order of magnitude. And we looked at those 20 markets that collected rigorous data, and it's a little bit of a wider range, but still average vendor sales across those markets vary from about $150 to about $500. you could pick a number, say in the middle of that range, or if you think you're on the low end, something on the low end, you think you're on the high end, something on the high end. And that'll again give you an estimate that's again likely to be closer to whatever your true gross sales are. So those are two ways that you can do it, just to have kind of in your head, back of the envelope sense of what your total economic impact is, without, if you're not going to be collecting total, gross vendor sales data each week. But you are, I think, who is doing this? Is this Amanda? Amanda is going to talk a little bit more about how you might collect that information.
Yeah, so better guesses on the next census would be awesome, but collecting more, seeing more markets collecting more data specifically would be great too. So getting a little bit into like, how does this actually happen? So collecting vendor sales data, like, I mean, my easy answer is you just ask your vendors what their sales for the day were, but how to do that. Give them, like, a lot of markets that do this, you just do it on a paper form that you give them and that they fill out and get back to you each week. And some markets are able to do it online using like a Google form or other survey tool, and emailing vendors and encouraging them to fill that out every week. This can be incredibly simple, just the vendor's name, the market date, and the sales amount. You can ask for other details if you want. I know in Washington State, they do a lot of breaking down the total into other product categories. I don't know how they manage to get their vendors to know all of that at the end of the day, to be honest, but just getting the total seems like a good place to start to me. Another thing you can do is asking them to rate how the sales were for them on some sort of scale, like a 1 to 4 scale of like poor sales that day, good sales, great sales, excellent sales. Just because one vendor's $400 for the day could be wonderful, but for another one, that's a real disappointment. So that just helps you interpret what is going on a little bit better with those individual vendors and gives you a chance to check in with them if their sales change a lot for one. You can find out what the reason is or what they saw happening that day. Let's see. Yeah, so once you have all the forms or you have everything brought in online, you can take all of those and then put it into one spreadsheet that you have all the sales recorded for the season. And then you set up formulas to add up totals and show averages. And then also, if you're collecting a crowd count, you can have it estimate the average sale per customer. So that's just like the mechanics of it. And that's actually not really the hard part. What might be the hard part in this is getting vendors in the practice of doing it and feeling like they can trust you. That's a little bit of what Amanda was talking about before. You can make it a requirement and you can put it in your rules. That's one way to do it. But I think what makes that work in practice is that, and also putting in your rules, that certainly gives vendors a chance to opt out of it. If they're applying and they feel really strongly about not reporting that stuff, they don't have to even start coming to your market. But what really works is expecting it to take a little bit of time to build the relationship with your vendors around this and showing and telling them over and over again the value that it provides. A huge part is reporting back what you find. I think Hannah was writing about that for Gorge Grown, that they report every month. Simply telling them what the sales have been like at the market and reporting it back in averages and aggregate will let them see how it looks when you talk about the data, and how you report things publicly and that it doesn't have their name attached to it. And it also offers them the chance to make their own insights on what you're reporting to them and get back to you and give you more insight about the data too. So now more about crowd counts. There's a few different ways to do crowd counts, but the one that OFMA most recommends and is used pretty widely across the country was actually developed here in Oregon in 1998 by OSU based off techniques that they experimented with and studied at the Corvallis Albany farmers markets. It involves counting people entering the market during a set period of time for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then multiplying it by 6 or 4 to get an estimate of the visitors for the hour. You do this once each hour and then add up the counts for the full day's total. The trick with this is knowing what your market's entrances are and having enough staff or volunteers available to station at those spots for the count times each hour. Some markets have very porous boundaries, so the counter people are actually monitoring a zone of the market rather than like a set marked entrance. See, it's ideal if you can do the counts every market day. Weather, market events, what's going on nearby in the neighborhood, popular seasonal produce, holidays, all of that can affect market attendance. So you want to, I'm just like, I want to capture all of that. But the next best might be once per month. So you do get an idea of that seasonality of the crowd. Next best, a couple times a season, preferably at what you might estimate would be the high point and the low points. But you know, even doing one crowd count per year will give you something to go on. And if you haven't done crowd counts before, we'd just love to see you try to do one of them this year and see what happens and what you find out. I think if you do one, you'll be like, now I want to do another one next month so I can compare. So anyway, you can still use those crowd counts to estimate out your season total, what they might be conservatively or maximally, and it'll give you better information than if you hadn't done it at all. We're going to put a link in the chat right now. It's got some vendor examples of templates of vendor sales collection forms. It's actually the toolkit that we use with we're going to be using with the Farmers Market Learning Network on data best practices for data collection. So we'd love to share that with the rest of you as well and see if you can put some of those tools to use at your market this coming year. Thank you.
Okay, and we have some time left for questions, answers, comments, anything. Thank you, Stephanie, for the link to the handheld counter. Those are so fun. I love using those just at my own house. Any questions, or does everybody feel like, oh, Stephanie, it would be great to have average sales so we can compare? Do you mean between markets or for vendors?
I'm interested in, comparing to other markets, ideally by the vendor type, because we do get inquiries from prospective vendors about what sales look like at our market. And it's hard to know if we're sharing information that makes us look good or not so good.
Sure.
Earlier in the presentation, I shared the averages by vendor type for the 5 markets in the sample. And again, we have big vendor categories. It's farm, it's value added, and it's craft and art. But that gives you at least a data point that might be useful.
Great. I'm not seeing any other comments or hands up. Hopefully we're all good. And early. Amanda predicted we would be early. Way to go. Well, thank you everyone so much for your time today. And of course, a giant, huge, enormous thank you to our census team, Dr. Mallory, Madeline, Amanda, Ari, you guys, and everyone that helped collect data and share your stories with us so that we can put it all together. Thank you so much. It's no small feat. And this is no small tool that we have now, and we couldn't have done it without you. I appreciate your time. And we look forward to hearing how you're continuing to use this and how you're continuing to work data collection into your market operations. And it's going to be great to watch over the coming years too, to see the trends and transformations that will come out of all of this. So Maddie has a question I missed, sorry. Was there any data collected on market location, lease prices, risk of displacement? Ooh, that is a great question. Amanda, Mallory, do you guys have anything
No, we haven't.
that would be helpful?
We haven't asked that one yet, but I'm like, oh my God, how did we not think of that one? That's so good. I want to know it right now. Next time.
Yeah, there's definitely a bit of like site characterization. Thank you, Rebecca. But yeah, maybe next time that will be great info to have. All right. Thank you, everyone, so much. Thanks for being here today. And thank you for everyone that helped put this together. Appreciate you.